Hey everyone, Clio here and welcome to another video. So, while I am currently stressing about whether I will still finish my January TBR, let's forget about that for a second and just focus on February, because February is a shorter month, but still I managed to put even longer books on there than I did in January. Yay! So without further ado, let's just dive into my February TBR. As will always be the case in 2021, this TBR contains only 5 books. They are, in this case, 4 physical reads and an audiobook, and they are 4 first-time reads and 1 reread. So in terms of my February TBR, quite a lot of it was set in advance, but that means that there are certain books that were already preset that I assigned to certain months at the beginning of the year. So the first 2 books on my TBR were decided already because of that. So first book on there is part of my Cosmere reread in 2021. I'm trying to read and reread quite a lot of the Cosmere. And so for the month of February, that means I'm rereading Warbreaker by Sanderson. At the center of Warbreaker are these 2 sisters. One of them, Vivenna, was always raised with the idea that one day she would be married off to the god king of the sort of like neighboring kingdom, this sort of like rival kingdom, as a sort of political alliance. However, her sister Ciri was kind of the sister who was left to her own devices. She wasn't really prepared for any sort of specific goal in life, but at the very last minute their father decides to send Ciri to marry the God King instead of Vivenna. This story is about Ciri having to tackle this new situation, having to live this role that she was never prepared for, and where she doesn't really understand the intricacies of the court that she is now entering into, while at the same time also looking at Vivenna, who is in secret going after her sister, wanting to try and save her. The magical system within this one is built off of the idea of using the breath as a sort of source for magic. And this book actually has quite some interesting connections when it comes to Stormlight Archive, for example. Some of the characters within this book we will be seeing again within Stormlight Archive, so it's a very interesting one for you to dive into if you have the idea of one day also reading Stormlight Archive. I very much enjoyed this book. I read this actually in 2020, so it's a very recent reread for me, so I'm gonna hope that this means that I'm gonna remember quite a lot about this one, because my reread of Elantris definitely made it clear that even though I remembered quite a bit of that, there were still some very big plot elements that I had completely forgotten about. But so yeah, looking forward to this one, but it is also a chunky little boy, and so it's even longer than Elantris was, and yeah, the other books on here aren't shorter. Secondly, another book that was already fixed was The Ambassador's Mission by Trudi Canavan. This is the first book in the sort of like sequel trilogy to the Black Magician trilogy. Now, the Black Magician trilogy is centered around the character of Sonia, who was this sort of street urchin who through circumstances found out that she had magical powers, even though magical powers were believed to be only something of the nobility. And so a lot of the trilogy centers around the sort of prejudices against lower class citizens by the upper class citizens, but also vice versa, the way in which the lower class citizens look at the upper class citizens because of the way that they have been treated by them all of the time. There's a lot more involved, of course, but I won't go into too much in order to not spoil anything. This second trilogy, I don't know exactly what is going to happen with it. I think we are, in part at least, following some of the same characters. I don't know whether there will be a central role assigned to them or whether they will be more on the outskirts, and whether we will be placing the story more in the hands of some other new characters that we're introducing. But we'll have to discover as I go through it. I very much love the Black Magician trilogy. Don't need to reread it because I do have a good memory of that one, and I'm absolutely sure that I do because I remember the ending. That's basically, if I don't remember the ending, then that means that probably need to reread it. The third book on my TBR was also one that I didn't really have much choice on, because I obviously had choice for all of these books. But what I mean with that is also that this is one that was assigned to the month of February already in advance by me, and so this would be Don Quixote de la Mancha Part 2. So in January I should have finished Don Quixote de la Mancha Part 1. I can be fairly optimistic that I'm going to finish it. I am about 150 pages or something away from finishing the first part of Don Quixote at this point in time, and I see no problem with me finishing it within the month of January. So in Don Quixote de la Mancha we are following our protagonist Don Quixote, who is this man who has read too many chivalry novels and has started to blend fiction and reality. He started to imagine his own life as being at the center of a chivalry novel. So he wants to become a knight-errant, run around the countryside and trying to solve people's problems. However, he is met by a lot of ridicule, he is met with a lot of violence, and most of his schemes go terribly wrong. Now, I am not entirely sure what's going to be happening in this part 2, because I will say that while I have thoroughly enjoyed parts of this book and I am enjoying some of the directions that the story is taking from time to time, it so far doesn't really seem to merit its 1,000 plus page length. There's a lot of circularity to it. There are a lot of stories within stories that don't necessarily seem to need to be there in order to tell this story. And so I'll have to kind of decide on that when I finish the entirety of the book. However, it's also not the case anymore that I'm kind of bored with it. There were a couple of chapters in there at like the 20% point or something like that that were kind of dragging, and it seemed like this was just going to be a sort of like episodic book in which every single chapter was a new adventure and all of the adventures would interrelate. However, we did definitely move past that sort of episodic nature, and we did get to a little bit more of an overarching plot, or at least certain storylines that take place over like 5 or 6 chapters, for example. So that definitely was an improvement again after that point. So I would definitely say if you were trying this book and you at some point get into this sort of rut, do definitely try and stick in there a little bit longer. I think the chapter 22 or something is when things start to turn around. So do definitely stick in for a little bit longer than that to see whether it's for you or not. But so yeah, I am going to be reading this one again. I don't know whether I'm going to be sticking to reading the Spanish and then listening to the English as I've been doing for the majority of the month of January, because I have noticed that I have, on certain days, I've decided to just listen to the English audiobook and not bother with the Spanish version, because I just don't have the energy for it or the time for it. And because I'm not overly enjoying my read, you know, I'm enjoying it just fine, but it's nothing that's blowing my mind. It's also not really encouraging me or exciting me to put in the effort to read the original Spanish versus the easier option of just listening to the English audiobook. So these are the 3 books that were kind of preset for my month of February that I had set at the beginning of the year, and so at this point in time I didn't really need to think about my first 3, so I basically had 2 more books that I could freely fill in there. And originally the 2 books that I had put there were books that I had at some point put on a TBR in 2020 but that I hadn't gotten around to. But then Sarah from Voyage Through Words sent out a tweet asking if somebody wanted to buddy read a particular book, and I want to read that book so much. And it was probably going to be one of those books that I, at the end of 2021, I might not have even gotten to, because I would have felt like there are so many other books that I need to get around to first, or that I need to prioritize over that one. So yeah, it's a good thing that I decided to say yes, though for my TBR it's a little bit of a challenging one, because it means that this is the 4th book over 500 pages that I'm putting on that February TBR, and that will be The Ruin of Kings by Jenn, Lyons. So this is the first book in a course of dragons, and so we will be reading the first 3 books over the course of the 3 coming months. So that will mean that in the next 3 coming months I will also have 3 fixed books on my TBR all the time. But so I made that decision. I'm perfectly happy with that decision, though I'm also a little bit hesitant about the reality of how that's going to go. But yeah, I am happy. I wanted to read more fantasy. The reality of reading more fantasy is, of course, reading a lot more thicker books. So basically the reason for this buddy read will be that the 4th book within the series is getting published, which I'm assuming is going to be in May then, and so we wanted to catch up to this series before the publication date of the 4th book. And so in this one we are following a bastard orphan who turns out to be a long lost heir. While it is very much a typical fantasy trope, I actually do really love that trope personally, and when I'm just like imagining stories in my head as a sort of pastime, I do that in order to try and fall asleep, for example. I often use that trope myself. So it is a trope near and dear to my heart. But this story, seems to be taking that trope but doing something new with it as well, because we're not really looking at the long lost heir trying to reclaim his throne. Seems like he's given his throne back quite easily. but it seems to be a lot about how he has become a sort of pawn in the political power plays of the people around him. And so while he's gone from being this little sort of orphan boy to getting a high position of power, becoming the most powerful person within this kingdom, it seems to be very much about how he's very much been treated as a sort of easy target to put on the throne, and how you know, the people around him are basically just using him. I like myself political fantasy. I think political fantasy is probably my favorite subgenre in fantasy, or at least it's one that I enjoy thoroughly. So I'm hoping for a lot of political intrigue, but this premise definitely seems to deliver on that. And then secondly, there's also this idea that he is not really a hero, but that he's destined to be the destroyer of all. Don't really know how that fits in with this sort of idea of being the long lost heir and being used in a political power play, how that's all going to play out, but it does sound like it's very interesting. Yeah, I'm very intrigued. I am very much looking forward to reading this book, and so even though it's another big book added to my TBR, I just couldn't say no, and here we are. Which means that the final book that I'm putting on this TBR is gonna be a short one. So I abandoned the idea of putting books on here that I put on TBRs in 2020 but didn't get around to, so instead I put another 2020 purchase that I didn't read in 2020 on there, and that will be Glass Town by Isabel Greenberg. So this is a graphic novel about the Brontes. So this is basically a look at this sort of fantastical world, or this imaginary world that the Bronte siblings created. So I don't think all of the Bronte siblings wrote within this world. I am not entirely sure which ones it was who wrote within this world. Doesn't say so. But so we are going to be looking at that world that they created, but I think the Brontes themselves are also inhabiting that world rather than the characters that they create for that world. But so yeah, I'm interested to dive into this one. It has a sort of like interesting color palette too, because it's very like bland in the sense, because it usually just has like two colors that are the center of like all of the pages, it seems. So it doesn't have too many vibrant colors to it, which kind of for me emphasizes that idea of a parallel world, but I don't know where that idea is actually coming from, or whether that would make sense to anybody else. But so in any case, I'm interested to dive into this one, learn more about the Brontes, especially about their brother Bramwell, who is, you know, kind of overshadowed by his sisters. For once it's the women overshadowing the guys, but I still want to learn more about this figure of Bramwell as well as about the other Bronte sisters, as I'm kind of reading a little bit more of them. You know, I read Jane Eyre quite a long time ago at this point in time, but I have only recently read an Anne Bronte, and I've yet to read a Emily Bronte, which will be the case in October normally. I will probably put it on my October TBRs. Yeah, looking forward to diving into this one, and as it is a graphic novel, it will be a nice, easy read for me to get through, to kind of get in between of those big bad books that are on there for the rest of my months. So, 3 big fantasy books, a big fat classic, and a short graphic novel. That will be my month of February. Wish me luck. I am going to need it.